Workers organize. Notice that some of this is in chapter 17, but some of it's also in chapter 19, because this is looking at that revolt, basically. So workers obviously are facing some problems during this time period. And so we're seeing this tension between management versus the laborers. And a lot of this is going to be because of periods of growth and contraction in America. For instance, we actually have two different prolonged depressions during the late 1800s. One was in 1873 and the other was in 1893. And this threw a lot of laborers out of work. And especially if you were a skilled worker, you were hit particularly hard. Any kind of hope of becoming like a manager or starting one's own business really disappeared in this time period. So the thing is, after the Civil War, all the way leading up to World War I, these workers are going to fight this loss of independence and the gains of industrial capital, but they're sharing in very little of the gains, by organizing and striking. Now, really quick, before I get into all these different times they organize and the different organizations and how they strike and specific strikes, I want to talk about striking just really quick. Striking generally during this time period came hand in hand with violence. We have a long history of violent strikes or violent protests in America. And so I want you to keep that in mind, but I also want you to keep in mind that some of the violence is started by the strikers themselves, a lot of times trying to capture America's attention and everything. And a lot of times the violence is actually started by those trying to stop them from striking. So, giving examples of both of these kinds of things. One example of strikers really being the ones who were more violent was the Pennsylvania coal region. We're going to see some Irish miners are going to gather into a secret labor organization known as the Molly Maguires. Now, the Molly Maguires were technically named for a particular woman who had been in Ireland that had held massive protests against landlords back in like the 1840s. So you can see this is definitely going to be Irish in this background of this. Now, the thing is, the Molly Maguires in America are going to then go on to carry out the selective murders of coal company officials until 1877, when an infiltrator basically exposed the group and its activities. From there, 20 members of the group would be found guilty of murder and actually executed. Now, this was actually a really, up until that point, you could go, okay, this seems like a black and white issue. What becomes a really big gray area here is when you look at the trials, the thing is all of those who were put on trial were Irish Catholic. And at this time, Catholics were excluded from juries. So you know how you're supposed to be a jury of your peers? It's questionable if they actually really got that. However, this is not the only kind of strike we see. We also see things like in 1877, when the Molly Maguires were actually found out, we have a great railroad strike known as the Great Uprising. This actually included 4 of the largest railroads in America, and this is amidst a depression. Remember, we have one in 1873 start, so we're kind of in that time period at this time. What happened was there was a series of pay cuts over the 4 preceding years, and then these railroad companies decide to cut wages yet again. So workers are going to strike. They start protesting, and actually our president, Rutherford B. Hayes at this time, would dispatch federal troops to protect the railroad line's property. This infuriated even more railroad workers who joined in, and then you start seeing violence. State militia would open fire on these strikers and their families and kill not just men striking, but women and children would be caught in the crossfire. You get news of the violence spreading, and so then you get even more strikes across the nation. And once again, you start seeing even more police and federal troops clashing with these strikers. In the end, the Great Uprising is a failure. The workers don't get what they wanted. But it was really notable because you see workers' cooperation across ethnic and even racial lines. And this is going to be important come a new group, the Knights of Labor. Now, the Knights of Labor is going to be formed a bit later, and it was a union of craft workers that had been bolstered by the Great Uprising. And the thing is, they were really remarkably inclusive. They welcomed Black members and women into their ranks. They're going to go and set up several different railroad strikes in like 1884 and 1885, and they are victorious in these. And their membership is going to be over, well, actually, it's nearly 1 million workers by 1886. They would stage more than 1,500 strikes across the United States, which would include more than 340,000 workers. Of course, when they have these strikes, though, and I'm going to jump to the next bullet point before I come back to the Haymarket strike. When they have these strikes, employers don't like it, because when you have a strike, a lot of times workers walk off the job, which hurts production. And of course, employers don't want to hurt production because that's how they make their money. And so we're going to see employers fight back, just as we saw with the Great Uprising, by like persuading courts to order the strikers to go back to work, or they might cooperate with like local authorities to have police officers come in and arrest the strikers for things like trespassing or obstructing traffic. And when they, at one point, the Knights of Labor was going through a strike, and police officers came in, and they actually managed to kill 4 unarmed workers during a skirmish in Chicago. Well, this led to rioting in response, that these police officers killed unarmed workers. And so rioting breaks out even more so, and this ends up leading to the Haymarket strike and Square incident. Basically what happened is, in Haymarket Square in Chicago, a bomb exploded at a meeting, and this was set by someone, we're not quite 100% sure who, that was on the labor side, so on the union side of things. And it was protesting the slayings done by the police officers earlier. The thing is, this bomb killed 7 policemen as well as 4 strikers, and 100 others were actually wounded. Someone had to pay for the Haymarket strike, basically, and so 8 strike leaders are going to be tried for these deaths. And actually 4 would go on to be executed, despite there being actually very little evidence that linked the leaders of the strike to this bombing. However, the fact that this bombing is going to be associated with the Knights of Labor, it is going to weaken that organization. Another organization I want to talk about is the AFL. They're going to come up a lot in this class. This is the American Federation of Labor. It was founded in 1886. It was a major organized body of skilled workers. So they're going to be way less ambitious than like the Knights of Labor, and they're way less inclusive. So it is not going to have women or Black people. They'd emphasize a lot of collective bargaining. They had a lot of negotiations between management and union representatives, securing workplace concessions. They were a lot more effective in meeting the needs of skilled workers, but this means that they're leaving out of their ranks like unskilled workers. AFL, they are going to organize their skilled workers by craft and focus on like basic workplace issues depending on the craft, because if you were a steel worker versus a railroad worker, obviously you're going to have different issues. They're going to have, because of this, really excellent cohesion and discipline, and actually 60% of the strikes done by the AFL were successful, which is amazing because most of the time strikes failed. Now, that being said, there's a lot of other strikes that are going to still going on at this time. For instance, Andrew Carnegie has to deal with the Steelworkers Union at one point. They tried to take away the union's bargaining power. It's, once again, you see violence coming in, a confrontation. Pennsylvania's governor calls out the state militia to open the plant and protect non-union workers. The union ends up capitulating in 4 months. We also get things like the Pullman strike, where you're going to see a cut in wages. That there's a lot more to it than just cut wages, but that's a simplified version of it. Workers would then appeal to the support of like the ARU, which is the American Railroad Union, led by Eugene V. Debs. His name is going to be important way later, so I want to mention it here. Technically, Eugene V. Debs and the ARU wasn't associated with the AFL, but they had won their own strike back in 1894 against the Great Northern Railroad. And so basically the ARU and Eugene V. Debs are going to order a boycott of trains that had Pullman cars, and this is going to disrupt like train traffic across the United States. Of course, railroads claim, oh, they're just innocent bystanders in this and everything like that, and they try to fire workers who refused to handle Pullman cars, but this actually led to just like all the ARU members just walking off the job. And so there's a big deal because this cripples rail travel nationwide. However, once again, we see like the president getting involved, not on the laborers' side. We see President Cleveland during this time would order federal troops to enforce a federal court injunction against the strike. Eugene V. Debs actually ends up being arrested, and the strike in the union is broken. So this does not work out in the strikers' favor. This is just a really quick primary source. This is an address by George Engel. He was one of the condemned Haymarket anarchists of 1886. So he was one of the ones who was executed, even though there's very little evidence that shows that he was involved in the making or planting of the bomb. And so I want you to read through this. I'm going to read it out loud really quick. And I want you thinking about what things are similar to today and what kinds of issues these people were facing at this time. So he says, when in the year 1872, I left Germany because it had become impossible for me to gain there by the labor of my hands a livelihood such as man is worthy to enjoy, the introduction of machinery having ruined the smaller craftsmen and made the outlook for the future appear very dark to them, I concluded to fare with my family to the land of America, the land that had been praised to me by so many as the land of liberty. On the occasion of my arrival at Philadelphia on the 8th of January, 1873, my heart swelled with joy and the hope and in the belief that in the future I would live among free men and in a free country. I made up my mind to become a good citizen of this country and congratulated myself on having left Germany and landed in this glorious republic. And I believed my past history will bear witness that I have ever striven to be a good citizen of this country. This is the first occasion of my standing before an American court, and on this occasion it is murder of which I am accused. And for what reasons do I stand here? For what reason am I accused of murder? The same that caused me to leave Germany. The poverty, the misery of the working classes. This is continued. When in 1878 I came here from Philadelphia, I strove to better my condition, believing it would be less difficult to establish a means of livelihood here than in Philadelphia, where I had tried in vain to make a living. But here too I found myself disappointed. I began to understand that it made no difference to the proletarian whether he lived in New York, Philadelphia, or Chicago. In the factory in which I worked, I became acquainted with a man who pointed out to me the causes that brought about the difficult and fruitless battles of the working men for the means of existence. He explained to me by the logic of scientific socialism, quick note here, so that's going into that social Darwinism right there, how mistaken I was in believing I could make an independent living by the toil of my hands. So long as machinery, raw material, etc. were guaranteed to the capitalists as private property by the state. So I want you to think, you can either go back to anything from this video or this particular primary source, how can we compare any of this to society today?